Whatever Happened To series, this time on the Nevada ranchers who stonewalled federal agents. This is Special Report. Good evening, welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. President Trump and his administration are talking optimistically, at least publicly, regarding his goal of sweeping tax reform. One day after the passage in the House, his chief spokeswoman is expressing optimism about the prospects in the Senate, despite reports of dissension in the GOP ranks. This as the president made headlines by commenting on the Al Franken sexual harassment case, by remaining silent on the accusations against Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore, and by doing something we did not expect about his Supreme Court choices going forward. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts starts us off tonight.
In his only public appearance today, meeting NCAA championship teams, President Trump said nothing about any of the big items in the news, but did weigh in on Twitter. On tax reform, President Trump was over the moon about the passage of the House bill, tweeting, quote, "Great numbers on stocks in the economy. If we get tax cuts and reform, we'll really see some great results." The president also taking aim at the fact not a single Democrat voted for the bill, accusing Democrats of a lost opportunity, tweeting, quote, "If Democrats were not such obstructionists and understood the power of lower taxes, we would be able to get many of their ideas into bill." The next stop on the legislative road is the Senate. The bill was voted out of the Finance Committee yesterday, but not without some serious heat across party lines.
I come from the poor people, and I've been here working my whole stinking career for people who don't have a chance. And I really resent anybody saying that I'm just doing this for the rich. Give me a break. I get kind of sick and tired of it.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
it's not true.
With all due respect, I get sick and tired of the richest people
Regular order,
in the country
Mr. Chairman.
getting richer and
Regular
richer.
order. Bill is passed.
It's not just Democrats who oppose the tax reform bill. 6 Republican senators have said they're either no or on the fence, including Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, Tennessee's Bob Corker, John McCain and Jeff Flake of Arizona, Maine's Susan Collins, and Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Still, the White House is predicting success.
We certainly are still very confident that we're going to get this package passed, and we'd love to see some of the Democrats come on board and support this historic piece of legislation.
Didn't get any Democrats in the House. How does that portend for getting them in the Senate?
There's always hope.
President Trump also weighed in on the brewing controversy surrounding Senator Al Franken, tweeting, quote, "The Al Frankenstein picture is really bad, speaks 1,000 words. Where do his hands go in pictures 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 while she sleeps?" The president, who has faced his own allegations of sexual impropriety, was criticized for going after Franken, but staying quiet this week about Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore. Kellyanne Conway today suggested it's a matter of timing.
Well, Al Franken was a brand new news story yesterday, and the president weighed in, as he does on the news of the day, often enough. The Roy Moore story is 8 days old, and the president put out a statement during his Asia trip on that.
And the White House is looking ahead to the next vacancy on the Supreme Court, announcing 5 more names on the list of possible nominees. The additions include Amy Coney Barrett, whom President Trump appointed to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals this year, Britt Grant, who sits on the Georgia Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, a Bush appointee to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Kevin Newsom, whom President Trump appointed to Atlanta's 11th Circuit this year, and Patrick Wyrick, a new appointee to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. While there are currently no vacancies on the Supreme Court, there are rumblings that Justice Anthony Kennedy may retire sometime after Thanksgiving, and the White House wants to be fully prepared for that. Brett?
That would be something. John Roberts, live on the North Lawn. John, thank you. A Democratic senator, often named as a potential presidential contender in 2020, is taking major heat from Clinton loyalists tonight after declaring that Bill Clinton should have resigned from the presidency following the Lewinsky scandal that triggered his impeachment and other accusations of sexual misconduct. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen tells us about the latest controversy in the politics of sexual harassment.
Occupant of the New York Senate seat previously held by Hillary Clinton, Democrat Kirsten Gillibrand told the New York Times she now believes President Clinton
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Ms. Lewinsky.
Should have resigned amid the sexual misconduct charges that rocked American politics 2 decades ago.
Things have changed today, and I think under those circumstances, there should be a very different reaction.
For good measure, Gillibrand broadened her condemnation to include the Republican incumbent.
And I think in light of this conversation, we should have a very different conversation about President Trump.
Prominent Liberals at the Times, The Atlantic, and MSNBC have demanded a reckoning with the Clinton era when progressives and feminists defended the president and in some cases attacked his female accusers, among them Juanita Broaddrick, who claimed Mr. Clinton raped her in a hotel room.
Thank you for welcoming the President of the United States.
The former president had stumped for Gillibrand, prompting Philippe Reines, the acid-tongued former spokesman to Mrs. Clinton, to tweet with reference to the president's acquittal at his impeachment trial. Senate voted to keep President Clinton, but not enough for you, Senator Gillibrand. Over 20 years, you took the Clintons' endorsements, money, and seat. Hypocrite. Interesting strategy for 2020 primaries. Best of luck.
Boy, I think there's just a special place in hell for people like that. She has turned on the man who probably did more with his wife for her than anyone alive.
President Truman is bright and cheery, cane and all.
The historical reputations of presidents can change. Harry Truman left office with dismal approval ratings, but starting with Merle Miller's Plain Speaking in 1972 and culminating with David McCullough's Pulitzer-winning 1992 biography, the 33rd president rose steadily in public estimation. Conversely, disclosures by JFK's mistresses over several decades have somewhat tarnished his legacy. Arthur Herman is the author of a new book about the 28th president, entitled 1917, Lennon, Wilson, and the Birth of the New World Disorder.
I think this is an inflection point for Bill Clinton's legacy, and I think more and more what we're seeing and historians are going to see is that he's someone who diminished that office and that his legacy will be very different from the one that we had thought when he left office.
Bill Clinton did not respond to our request for comment. Of course, he has long denied that rape allegation. George H.W. Bush also faces new scrutiny this week as several women have now accused him of groping them, including one of them, Bret, who said the incident took place during his presidency.
It's an amazing time. We are hearing more from Hillary Clinton about why she thinks she did not get to the office her husband once held.
Yes, the former Democratic nominee has told the left-wing magazine Mother Jones that Russian interference was, quote, one of the major contributors to the outcome of the 2016 campaign.
I think that there are lots of questions about its legitimacy, and we don't have a method for contesting that in our system.
Mrs. Clinton also cited registration issues and problems at polling stations as a major factor in her loss of Wisconsin, the state no Republican had carried since 1984 and which Mrs. Clinton, Bret, was the first major party nominee to skip campaigning in during a general election since 1972.
More on all this with the panel. James, thank you. Women's groups say Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore is trying to intimidate the women accusing him of sexual misconduct. Today, Moore's wife spoke her mind. Correspondent Peter Ducey is on the story from Birmingham.
Today, Judge Roy Moore remained out of sight, but his wife Kayla defended him on the steps of the state capitol.
Wow. We're in a battle.
Kayla Moore contends her husband, accused of sexual misconduct by multiple women, is a gentleman.
Even after all the attacks against me, against my family, against the foundation, and now against my husband, he will not step down.
That's right. Dozens of women surrounded Mrs. Moore in Montgomery, trying to counter her husband's accusers.
I've never heard a whisper or a rumor about Judge Moore and these kinds of sexual activity.
Others sought to scrutinize Republican leaders in D.C. who have called on Moore to quit for things he denies doing.
They're not calling for Al Franken to step down, by the way. Did you notice that? The guy's guilty. He's got a picture. He's admitted it. And yet, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Ted Cruz, they're not calling for him to step down. How about the hypocrisy?
A source close to Moore backer Steve Bannon told Fox Today, quote, this race is really between Judge Roy Moore and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. But it's also a race where women voters are breaking for the Democrat. A Fox News poll gives Doug Jones a 26-point advantage with women over Roy Moore.
You think Alabama is just some place with a bunch of hayseeds?
Whose supporters angrily confronted reporters on Thursday when questions at a press conference focused exclusively on Moore's accusers.
And show you how angry you are.
Questions about the issues.
There's no doubt about the accuracy of a Moore attorney's assertion that Judge Moore presided over accuser Beverly Young Nelson's 1999 divorce.
There was contact.
A review of court records finds she never appeared before him and that another judge handled all but one motion. The surging Democrat Jones drew a big crowd in Dothan today as his campaign tries to capitalize on bad headlines about his opponent.
I think for all women, we're at a tipping point in this country that we are seeing, and we're empowering women to stand up and speak out. And I think that that's a wonderful thing.
This afternoon, Roy Moore found out he'll have the vote of a big-name Republican official here in Alabama, the governor, Kay Ivey, who says she doesn't have any reason to doubt Moore's accusers, but she thinks it's most important to send a Republican senator from Alabama to Washington. Brett?
Follow this. Peter Ducey live in Birmingham. Peter, thank you. Now to news overseas. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is calling for a return to civilian rule in Zimbabwe. America's top diplomat made the statement as longtime President Robert Mugabe made his first public appearance at a graduation ceremony since his house arrest earlier this week. The military says there has been significant progress in negotiating the terms of Mugabe's removal. There could be a change at the top in Saudi Arabia as soon as next week. It's a change the world has seen coming for a while, and many expect major fallout, not only in the kingdom, but in the entire Middle East. Correspondent Rich Edson is live tonight at the State Department with the story of an ascendant new king. Good evening, Rich.
Yeah, good evening, Brent. And Saudi King Salman will transfer power to his 32-year-old son next week. That's according to a report in a British publication. However, it is unconfirmed. What we do know is that the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is next in line to the Saudi throne and is significantly strengthening his position. He's leading an anti-corruption campaign. Authorities arrested more than 200, including princes, rivals, billionaires, and government officials. Regional reports claim the Saudi government is offering some their freedom if they surrender assets. That campaign is also expanding. As the Wall Street Journal reports, authorities rounded up at least 24 Saudi military officers, including multiple commanders. It's unclear if the government is charging them or using those officers as witnesses. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has said last week that he has some concerns about the arrests in Saudi Arabia, though he says as pertaining to the Saudi government, it all depends on how these particular individuals are dealt with. Saudi Arabia is also facing international challenges, a proxy fight with Iran that is the basis for conflict in Yemen, in Syria, and in Lebanon. Earlier this month, the Saudi-backed Prime Minister of Lebanon resigned, and he did so from Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Said Hariri claims Iran-backed Hezbollah is overwhelming Lebanon's government.
I wanted to cause a positive shock for the Lebanese in order to know what a dangerous place we were in, because we cannot continue in that way, that we say we are distancing Lebanon from regional conflicts, while we found a Lebanese party in Yemen and other places is building up relations with the Syrian regime, which I will not conduct.
His Hezbollah adversaries in Lebanon claim Saudi Arabia is detaining Hariri. Hariri denies that, says he's returning soon to Lebanon, though we'll stop in France first. Brett?
Rich Edson, live at the State Department. Rich, thank you. Up next, whatever happened to the Nevada ranchers who held off federal agents in a dispute over property rights? We'll have that story. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 11 in Los Angeles as Tesla unveils an electric semi-tractor trailer said to be capable of traveling 500 miles on a single charge with an 80,000-pound load. The company says the truck could revolutionize an industry long criticized for its air-polluting vehicles. Production is set to begin in 2019. Black Hills Fox in Rapid City, South Dakota, where company officials have shut down the Keystone Pipeline after a leak of about 210,000 gallons of oil. They say they do not believe it affected any surface water bodies or any drinking water systems. The leak comes as state regulators prepare for next week's decision on expanding the Keystone XL pipeline system. And this is a live look at New York from Fox 5. One of the big stories there tonight, as you see, a massive apartment fire in Hamilton Heights. The 5-alarm blaze has brought out more than 200 firefighters. They've been ordered to get off that roof. So far, no reports of injuries. That is tonight's live look. Outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. In tonight's Whatever Happened To report, the Nevada ranchers who engaged in a standoff with federal agents over grazing rights on their land. Patty Carlson on Facebook recently asked us about Eamon Bundy, who, along with his brother and father, is on trial right now in Las Vegas. National correspondent William Lajeunesse shows us what's happening.
I've tried to fight this thing legally, and I've tried to fight it politically, but we've got one more fight. We, the people, haven't fought yet.
In the spring of 2014, Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy claimed he was under attack by federal agents who wanted to seize his cattle and take his land. During the weeks-long standoff, federal agents tased Bundy's son Eamon and forced Cliven's sister to the ground.
We will not give up our land!
Hundreds of protesters answered his call. Heavily armed, they forced dozens of federal agents to stand down. More than 3 years later, in federal court, prosecutors argue Bundy tried to incite a range war. He is on trial for assault and obstruction. Along with sons Eamon and Ryan, they face life in prison.
I'm not afraid of the truth. The lies bother me.
Judge Gloria Navarro, an Obama appointee, let Ryan out of jail to prepare his own defense, but refused to release 71-year-old Cliven, fearing he won't obey federal police. In court, the Bundys wear prison-issued clothing instead of street clothes.
Well, they're in custody. They want the world to know they're in custody.
Prosecutors understand the symbolism, but insist they only seized Bundy's cattle after the rancher violated court orders and failed to pay $1 million in back grazing fees. The family argues Washington used that issue to turn their ranch into a federal monument, which is what it is today.
This is a very simple case. It's about a man and a family who ranched the land. The family's been ranching it for 150 years. The federal government comes in, they claim a right to manage that land, and the way they're managing it would have driven him out of business.
Cliven Bundy is a folk hero to those who see federal overreach in the West, where Washington controls more than 40% of the land in 9 western states. This trial could last several months. Brett?
William, thank you. If you have a suggestion for Whatever Happened To, let us know. Civil rights leader Jesse Jackson says he has been receiving outpatient treatment for Parkinson's disease for 2 years. Reverend Jackson told supporters today in a statement that he will continue to work, writing he would rather wear out than rust out. Now to this evening's Focus on Faith. Believers and others from all over the world are coming to Washington to see a new museum dedicated to the world's most famous book. Religion correspondent Lauren Green has the story.
The new Museum of the Bible officially opens its doors with a dedication ceremony in Washington, D.C. These doors show the magnitude of this museum, the first of its kind in terms of sheer size, scale, and scope. The 430,000 square foot, $500 million project is the brainchild of millionaire businessman Steve Green.
It's just thrilling to see people come through enjoying this labor of love that has been going on for years now.
It's now home to Bibles that came over on the Mayflower, as well as the first one ever printed in the United States. But early on, there was controversy around how some other antiquities on display were acquired. Green admits mistakes, paying $3 million in fines and forced to give back thousands of artifacts. But the museum is now following all standard guidelines.
Our desire is to tell this book story. We're not interested in showing or displaying anything that would be inappropriate.
Exhibits focus on the Bible's history, its story, and their impact on people. Biblical scholar Dr. Gordon Campbell says there's no other book in history that has had as much influence on the world as the Bible. He notes it has unrivaled status as a moral authority, especially for America's founding fathers.
What they have in common is a habitual tendency to articulate their thoughts and their moral values through the language of the Bible. And that appears to be independent of the variations in their faith.
The museum promotes the Bible's multicultural origins. There's a section devoted to the Hebrew scriptures and a rabbi who will be writing a Torah at the museum for the next year.
The museum couldn't come at a more critical time. Bible literacy is at an all-time low. Museum founders hope to engage people, helping them understand how something they may rarely read has had a great influence over their everyday lives. Brett?
Lauren, thank you. Definitely one to check out here in Washington. Stocks were off today. today. The Dow lost 100, the S&P 500 fell 7, the Nasdaq dropped 11. For the week, the Dow fell a quarter of a percentage point, the S&P 500 lost about an eighth, the Nasdaq gained a half. As the U.S. increases airstrikes against terrorists in Afghanistan, we talk with that country's chief executive. That's next. The U.S. Air Force is ramping up its airstrikes in Afghanistan, a sign that hostilities are increasing there as the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria seems to be winding down. Lucas Tomlinson has details from the Pentagon.
The U.S. military has dropped twice as many bombs on the Taliban and ISIS in Afghanistan this year compared to all last year, a level not seen since 2012, according to a new report by the U.S. Air Force. The rise of strikes coincides with roughly 3,000 additional American troops recently arriving in Afghanistan to ramp up the fight against the Taliban. The new soldiers and Marines will operate closer to the front lines, armed with the ability to call in more air power. There are now 14,000 U.S. troops on the ground. The U.S. Army's top officer acknowledged the new danger facing his soldiers.
If you're out there with the Afghan security forces, there will be an increased risk.
Over the last 6 months, the Taliban has increased the amount of territory it controls or influences. According to a recent U.S. government watchdog report, the Taliban now controls 13% of Afghanistan, compared to 11% 6 months prior. That means 700,000 more people are living under Taliban rule today. Almost half the country lives in districts controlled or contested by the Taliban. But as the U.S. and Afghan army go on the offensive, the number of civilian casualties has risen 52% in the first 9 months of 2017, compared to the same period a year ago, according to the watchdog report. Earlier this week, 4 U.S. troops were wounded in a suicide attack in Kandahar, the spiritual home of the Taliban. In late October, Chief Warrant Officer Jacob Sims, a helicopter pilot with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, died when his MH-47G Chinook crashed outside Kabul. A week later in November, Sergeant First Class Stephen Cribben, a Green Beret, was killed not far from the crash site, the 13th U.S. service member killed in Afghanistan this year. As the ISIS fight in Iraq and Syria winds down, expect more jets to be tasked to Afghanistan. Despite the planned increase, the total number of U.S. bombs dropped there is less than 8% of the total number dropped against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Brett?
Lucas Tomlinson at the Pentagon. Lucas, thank you. I got a chance to sit down with Afghanistan's chief executive, Dr. Abdullah, to talk about the situation in Afghanistan. I began by asking him about the future of that country, the threat from the Taliban, and the way forward for U.S. troops on the ground. Dr. Abdullah began by praising President Trump's South Asia policy, which includes a U.S. commitment that is not tied to a timeline.
I want to thank President Trump for the decision that he made. The important element of that policy, which is not the presence of troops are not time-bound, but rather it is condition-based. That has created certainty and brought clarity about the U.S. stance in support for Afghanistan. And together we can change it.
So the status of the Taliban now, I mean, there are some reports that say the Taliban is controlling or contesting in half of your country. Is that true?
There is no doubt that Taliban are there. Half of the country, of course not, but in parts of the country, in rural Afghanistan. And recently, since they are under pressure in the rural areas, they've increased their attacks in the cities. I mean, these are terrorist acts, suicidal acts, car bombs, which has led to civilian casualties, which has been unfortunate. We believe that the South Asia policy, the new policy on Afghanistan, will force Taliban, those of them which will be convinced and persuaded that they cannot win militarily, to join the peace process.
Do you have any evidence that Iran and or Russia is supporting the Taliban inside Afghanistan?
There are reports about it, but nevertheless, we are engaging with both countries. We are trying with those countries which have established contacts with the Taliban, to say the least, to convince them that to help. There are terrorist groups which are threats to Russia as well, including Central Asian republics. And the way forward, and the best way forward, would be to cooperate cooperate with Afghanistan and the international community.
There's always been this battle here in policy-wise dealing with Afghanistan, whether to engage the Taliban and to talk and to engage in talks and to try to bring some of those Taliban leaders in to the government somehow. Secretary of State Tillerson talked about this recently. Take a listen.
There are, we believe, moderate voices among the Taliban, voices that do not want to continue to fight forever. They don't want their children to fight forever. There's a place for them in the government if they're ready to come renouncing terrorism, renouncing violence, and being committed to a stable, prosperous Afghanistan.
Is that a viable way forward?
We are on the same page as far as talking to the Taliban are concerned. We have kept the door open for talks. So far, perhaps they believe that they can win militarily. Hopefully, the new policy, as well as our efforts within the country, will create conditions that those which will be willing to talk, they see an opportunity in it.
Is ISIS a factor in eastern Afghanistan particularly?
Yes, it is. ISIS is a factor in eastern Afghanistan, as well as in some parts of the northern Afghanistan. One important element in the U.S. policy has been a focus on safe havens. It's important because in insurgencies, safe havens could be training safe havens for leadership, safe havens, financial network safe havens, or ideological backing. To deal with them are essential, and hopefully the United States will find a way to engage with Pakistan.
For the Americans sitting at home, looking at the numbers, 16 years of war, 20,200 total wounded, and hundreds of billions of dollars spent. There's a portion of America that's just tired of this. What do you tell them to say it's important?
We understand that. The fact that the United States engaged in Afghanistan after September 11th, the threat of terrorism is not something that you can just simply wish it away. You have to deal with it. It's straightforward. And we are grateful to your country, your people for supporting us. At the same time, we believe that it is doable. A few years back, there were 120,000 American troops on the ground. Today, it's much less. Even with additional numbers, it's 1/10 of the number which existed there a few years back. That shows that increasingly we are shouldering the responsibility with the clear definition of the threat, which has happened as a result of South Asia policy. It is very straightforward, the situation. I'm sure that with resolve, determination, and commitment, and clear vision, it could be done.
Dr. Abdullah, we appreciate your time and best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Worth noting also that 2,240 U.S. personnel have paid the ultimate price in Afghanistan. Are Democrats in disarray over sexual harassment allegations, both present and past? And what about the White House? We'll get reaction from the panel when we come back.
Such behavior is not just inappropriate, it is immoral, and it is harmful, for it sends a message of what is acceptable behavior to the larger American family, particularly to our children.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for welcoming the President of the United States.
Is it your view that President Clinton should have stepped down at that time, given the allegations?
Yes, I think that is the appropriate response, but I think things have changed today, and I think under those circumstances, there should be a very different reaction.
Well, it's a very different reaction across the board now in the environment we're in when it comes to sexual harassment. This is Democrat, New York Senator, who previously obviously praised President Clinton. Kirsten Gillibrand saying, today I'm honored to be traveling around New York with President Clinton, campaigning for Hillary Clinton, letting New Yorkers know why I'm with her. As Dems in Philly, the Democratic Convention gathered to nominate our next president, kicked off DNC in Philadelphia with former President Clinton. Then former Hillary Clinton aide tweeted this. Ken Starr spent $70 million on a consensual blank job. Senate voted to keep POTUS WJC, but not enough for you, Senator Gillibrand. Over 20 years, you took the Clintons' endorsements, money, and seat. Hypocrite. Interesting strategy for 2020 primaries. Best of luck. It's just an interesting time. Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief for the Weekly Standard. Aaron McPike, White House correspondent for the Independent Journal-Review. And Charles Hurt, opinion editor for the Washington Times. Charlie.
Well, let's see. The Clinton era, I think, is officially over. Turns out that Ken Starr and the evil Republicans of the 1990s and Joe Lieberman, love that clip, they were all right at the time. And the Democratic Party is kind of coming around to admitting that. I do think that Philippe Reines has a bit of a point. It's sort of an odd timing to hear Senator Gillibrand come out now, and after 20 years of enjoying the political largesse of the Clintons, when it's so safe to come out and do this now, and then the follow-up where she seemed to sort of walk it back a little bit, and if you look at the New York Times article, she had someone call them back to make sure that she walked it back a little bit to say, oh, but it was a different time. No, that's not an answer. It was what Bill Clinton did 20 years ago was terrible, and it was terrible in those times, just as it would be terrible in these times.
All right. There's a lot of accusations about whataboutism, that there's like looking back at this time because there are these allegations against Senator Roy Moore, and obviously the allegations and accusers who are talking about President and then candidate Trump. Chris Hayes tweeted, as gross and cynical and hypocritical as the right's "what about Bill Clinton" stuff is, it's also true that Democrats and the center left are overdue for a real reckoning with the allegations against him. There have been now multiple articles, Aaron, about this reckoning, that suddenly this realism has suddenly hit people.
Well, the funny thing is, neither party is immune to this, and that is the important thing. Everybody's trying to figure out what the model is for how you respond to these things. I would point out that when Mitch McConnell became majority leader, his staff put together a guidebook on how they respond to individual members' crises, and he dealt with a number of them. You remember John Ensign in 2009 went through his extramarital affair and later resigned. Every scandal that came out, the McConnell operation knew how to respond. This is different. These harassment scandals are a very different breed of problem, and both parties are trying to figure out how to cope with it. And clearly they haven't come up, either party hasn't come up with a good model yet, and that's what we're seeing everybody sort through right now.
It seems like I'm using Twitter every second, but this was an interesting exchange. Chelsea Handler, a known Democratic supporter, and Juanita Broderick. Chelsea Handler, imagine being molested by an older man, then that man denies ever doing it, then goes on, gets elected to the United States Senate. What kind of message does that send to young girls everywhere and men, to all the men who abuse women? Obviously she is there referring to Senator Moore and the allegations. Juanita Broderick tweets back, yes, Chelsea Handler, I can imagine. I was raped by the Arkansas Attorney General, who then becomes governor and president, and NBC held my interview explaining the rape until after his impeachment hearing. But I'm sure you don't want to go there. Chelsea Handler, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing this. You are right, and I apologize to you for not knowing your story. Democrats, along with Republicans and the rest of the world's political parties, all need to do better and respect the first-hand accounts of victims. I believe you. Steve.
Well, you remember that was an issue during the campaign. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about Juanita Broderick and the accusations, I think credible accusations that she had leveled back then and repeated during the campaign, and she wasn't believed at the time. And people were believing accusers based on party affiliation rather than the substance or credibility of the allegations made. I mean, look, this is sort of the ultimate Washington hypocrisy story, right? I mean, everybody on every side pointing fingers in every different direction, people choosing teams because of political parties. You saw what Al Franken had said about President Trump. You've now seen what President Trump has done to respond. President Trump, who's been accused, I think, credibly by a number of women on his own, and who admitted on tape to doing some of these things, or at least being aggressive. This is why people don't like Washington. I mean, this is what this is. It's just finger pointing in every direction at everybody based on partisanship.
Is there some credit to be given to Republicans who haven't done that with Roy Moore? Almost from the very first allegations, they came out despite it being a problem for them, politically, and I mean across the board denounced him. And I don't know. I think that's probably a step in the right direction
for the most part. But I mean, there is obviously a corner of the party that.
But Republican leadership had wasted no time in saying we don't want anything to do with this. And
do you see it differently? I mean, obviously innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, but in a political race that is pending December 12th, it's a different scenario.
Well, you can't force the guy out, and it is up to the Alabama voters at this point. And
I think that's exactly right. And Sarah Sanders said that just yesterday. But look, when it comes to Al Franken too, I covered his 2008 Senate race, and back then, this particular thing wasn't out at the time. But everyone knew that he made rape jokes, and that was part of his past. And that was something that was discussed in that race at the time, and Minnesota still sent him to the Senate, albeit barely, but they did.
But see, I pointed out yesterday, had this allegation came out in 2006, 2007, the 225 vote margin that he wins by over Norm Coleman changes the trajectory of the U.S. Senate.
It absolutely might have, yeah.
All right, I want to play this soundbite from the White House. This is asked about the president weighing in on Franken and not on Moore.
This was covered pretty extensively during the campaign. We addressed that then. The American people, I think, spoke very loud and clear when they elected this president.
But how is this different?
I think in one case specifically, Senator Franken has admitted wrongdoing and the president hasn't. I think that's a very clear distinction.
That's the difference between the accusers of then candidate Clinton, candidate Trump, now President Trump, and Al Franken weighing in on that. But he also hasn't fully addressed the Roy Moore issue one-on-one. He's gone through a spokesman and said they're troubling. If true, he should step down.
Yeah, but he was very quick to jump on the criticism of Al Franken, and he hasn't. I mean, the Washington Post report, the I think devastating, very credible Washington Post report, sourcing to 4 women on the record in great detail, women who didn't know each other, I thought established very clearly early that these were credible accusations made against Roy Moore, and President Trump has avoided stepping in.
So does he get out? Roy Moore stay in and fight it? What happens?
No, I think he stays in.
So
he's not going anywhere.
Not going anywhere. Al Franken, what is to investigate?
I don't know, and I guess it's probably something going to the ethics committee in order to die, because I can't imagine what more they're.
He's admitted to it. There's pictures of it, and now it's going to an investigation in the Senate Ethics Committee.
Yeah, it's very.
I think he wants to show that there's nothing more there to clear his name.
Okay. Next up, the Friday lightning round: tax reform, the changing face of Saudi Arabia, and winners and losers.
Resent anybody saying that I'm just doing this for the rich.
With all due respect, I get sick and tired of the richest people.
Regular order, Mr. Chairman.
Getting richer and
regular order.
How many times do we do this before we learn this?
Listen, I come from the lower middle class originally. We didn't have anything. So don't spew that stuff on me. I get a little tired of that crap.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Chairman, no.
I'm so upset I can't even say no.
Orrin Hatch, the Senate, as the committee moved out the tax reform bill, got a little fiery Thursday night. We're back with the panel lightning round. Steve, tax reform in the Senate, where it's going?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, we've heard some, as we reported earlier, some objections raised by Ron Johnson and others raising some concerns about where it's headed. When I talked to a member of the House not long ago about where it was headed in the House, they said, we're going to pass something. It'll pass narrowly. It'll include most of the big reforms. Where it goes in the Senate, I have no idea.
Aaron.
Democrats next week are planning to flood Republican town halls, do everything they can on the ground in Republicans' home states when they're home for Thanksgiving, and they're only going to amplify their message. They're pulling out numbers. They're obviously talking about specific provisions, and Republicans are doing a lot of more broad-based, talking pointy sort of things when it comes to the tax reform bill. So I think you're going to see it lose a little bit of momentum next week.
The impetus to get something done, though, is pretty strong.
And the Roy Moore deadline adds to that. I was impressed by how the wide margin that it passed through the House. Obviously, the Senate is something different, but I think that underscores just how much pressure these people are under to produce something.
Changing face of Saudi Arabia, new king coming next week. Take a listen.
you are having radical ideas, some might say. Recently, you've announced that you will soon allow women to drive. You are allowing foreign investment in your beautiful country. Why now? What triggered this change in thinking?
We were not like this in the past. We only want to go back to what we were, the moderate Islam that is open to the world, open to all the religions.
So, our own Maria Bartiromo talking to the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who one report is saying will be king next week. Don't know if that's true or not, but clearly Saudi Arabia looks different.
It does, and I can't help but think that these are not positive changes.
Really? Aaron?
Positive changes, although you're hearing a little bit of mixed messages from the Trump administration on exactly how this is going forward right now.
Some of this is about consolidation of power inside Saudi Arabia, but most of it is about the growing strength of Iran and Iran's domination of the region.
And countering that. All right, winners and losers.
My winner is Rukmini Callimachi, a New York Times terrorism reporter. I spend a fair amount of time beating up on reporters for bias. Rukmini was on a panel today at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies where she laid out in a clear and methodical way the extent to which the Obama administration played down the threat from al-Qaeda dating back to before the 2012 election. It was an impressive performance.
Based on the bin Laden documents.
Based on the bin Laden documents. My loser is Kay Ivey, the Alabama governor, for saying today, I have no reason to disbelieve any of them talking about the accusers of Roy Moore, but she's still going to vote for Roy Moore for Senate.
Aaron?
Doug Jones in Alabama, the winner. He is now leading in polls, drawing in the money, and it doesn't look like Roy Moore is going anywhere, as we have discussed. Loser, Jared Kushner, because the Russia probe continues to get at him for information he has not yet disclosed.
Charlie?
Winner of the week for the second time this year is Mitch McConnell for inserting the Obamacare mandate repeal into the tax bill. If he succeeds at this, he will single-handedly have fetched out of the fire Donald Trump's entire legislative agenda. It's still a tall order, but that's a pretty impressive thing. Loser of the week is Bill Clinton, obviously. They're done. It's over. The era is over, and his chickens have come back to roost.
It started with Donna Brazil and went into this week. Okay, panel, thank you. When we come back, this week's notable quotables.